Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu. Welcome to the Islamic Advice Podcast. I'm your host Majid. Today I'm joined by a very special guest, founder and host of the Islamic History Podcast, Brother Muttaqi Ismail. Assalamu alaikum, bro, and it's a great pleasure to have you back on the show.
Wa alaikum salam, Brother Majid. Alhamdulillah, thank you for having me, and I'm glad to be here also. We're going to talk some important stuff today, inshallah.
Yeah, certainly, bro, certainly. I mean, for the audience, it's been a while since I released a new episode. The last one was in Ramadan. However, alhamdulillah, we're back, inshallah ta'ala, and back with a bang. And in fact, myself and Brother Muttaqi, we've been planning this podcast for a while now. And I hope we can do justice to the topic for today's podcast, which, as people will know, is on the issue of slavery, the Islamic viewpoint on slavery, also from a historical point of view as well. And as Brother Muttaqi may agree, the topic of slavery, it's in America, certainly, it's as current today as it was a couple of centuries ago, especially for, the Afro-Americans. It's something which is linked directly to the plight of the black man in the US today. And in recent years, we've seen the calls for statues of historical figures to be removed due to, their link to slavery. And as Brother Muttaqi, we spoke about this previously, that it's been over a year now since the killing of the murder of George Floyd. We know that tensions sort of rose once again, and even though the 13th Amendment abolished slavery back in 1865, for many of the sort of black community, they're still not considered as equals. And also another important point, I think, which will be key to this topic, is the link between Islam and slavery and the viewpoint that Islam has on slavery. Because what I'm seeing in recent times is that there is fingers pointing towards Islam and Muslims and Arabs in particular as being, part of a rampant slave trade, not just in Africa, but for also, white people too. I mean, there's a reference that I came across. I'm not sure, Brother Muttaqi, if you've heard this, but even the term slave has its origins from the word Slav, and it's, from what's documented is that, the Slavic people were kind of enslaved by the Muslims during the 9th century. So there's a lot of finger pointing, and maybe it's a way of deflecting and trying to conceal the sort of crimes of Europeans, or of those who enslaved people during the transatlantic slave trade. But there's loads to discuss, and there's no one better, alhamdulillah, to have on the show other than Brother Muttaqi to discuss this huge and controversial topic. So, bro, I want to start off with the first question, get the discussion going, right? And the first question really is, what is the Islamic viewpoint position on slavery? Because I feel that this is, many Muslims find this topic troublesome.
Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Alhamdulillahi Rabbil Alameen. Wa salatu wa salamu ala Sayyidina Muhammad. Well, the Islamic viewpoint on slavery, as far as I understand it, is, generally speaking, Islam does allow slavery. It has not prohibited slavery. There's no verse in the Quran that prohibits slavery. But just because Islam allows something does not necessarily mean that we have to do it, or that it's actually necessarily good in all cases. So divorce is an example of something that Islam allows, but generally speaking, divorce is not a good thing. But nonetheless, Islam, just like Christianity and Judaism and pretty much every other religion that I'm aware of, every other major world religion does permit slavery. However, in the Quran, there are no verses in the Quran that tell us how to acquire slaves. There's no verse in the Quran that says this group of people are slaves and this group of people are not. It doesn't say this person is to be enslaved or this group of people is to be enslaved. There's nothing in the Quran that says that. But there are multiple verses in the Quran that tell us to free slaves and reasons to free slaves and why we should free slaves and how we should free slaves and things like that. There are multiple verses like that. So, and that's going to play out hopefully later on in the conversation, inshallah. So in Islam, there's only one legitimate way to acquire slaves, one legitimate way. Doesn't mean Muslims have not violated this rule, but the only legitimate way to acquire slaves in Islam is through warfare, not through kidnapping, not through debt, not for crimes, not for rebellion, none of those sort of things. Well, rebellion, I guess, would lead to war, so that could be it. But generally speaking, the only way to acquire slaves would be through warfare. And even then, it would have to be against non-Muslims. Muslims cannot proactively enslave another Muslim who was not a slave before. Even a Muslim rebel who rebelled against the government and was defeated couldn't be enslaved. Imprisoned, yes. Executed, yes, but not enslaved. So there's that. But the only legitimate way to acquire slaves in Islam is through warfare, where the captured POWs, or even sometimes the captured populace, the conquered populace, could be enslaved. They could also, according to the tradition and the culture of the times, in many cases when a city or nation was conquered by another nation, then the men were killed and the women and children were enslaved. That happened throughout the world, not just with Muslims, throughout the world. Sometimes the entire population was wiped out, not just the men.
Yeah.
So this was a common thing at that time. However, if for whatever reason the rulers of the government or the conquering army decides not to execute their defeated foes, they may choose to ransom them, or they may choose to enslave them. This happened in many cases when Salahuddin al-Ayyubi reconquered Jerusalem. Many of the Latins or the Franks who were residing in Jerusalem, they were either ransomed away, or those who could not be ransomed, many of them were actually sold into slavery. So this is a common thing throughout most of the world, not just the Muslim world, most of the world before and after Islam. When Muslim cities were conquered by Christians, Muslims were enslaved and men were killed and women and children were enslaved. It happened throughout history on both sides. So that's the basic view. Now, of course, while we say that a Muslim cannot be enslaved by another Muslim, and when we say that the only way to enslave a person legitimately in Islam is through warfare, while we say those are the rules, obviously, over 1,400 years and billions of people, those rules have been violated many, many times. But those were individuals who violated the rules or were operating on their own accord, not by the rules of Islam.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, we see from the research that I was doing, we see in effect that there's actually it's like there's an obsession with emancipation if you look within the Quran and the Sunnah, in regards to, first of all, what we see is that the situation of slavery at the time before Islam, there were many things which Islam actually kind of outlawed, that you couldn't acquire slaves in this way, or even the treatment of slaves. But one thing we see consistently throughout the Quran and throughout the Sunnah is the call for emancipation, whether it's to do with it's even linked to righteousness, in the sense like Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in the Quran that if you are righteous, then you free slaves. Obviously, if you have a slave, you free a slave. Even in Surah Balad, where Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, and what will make you realize what attempting the challenging path is, because here Allah talks about the two paths, the path of righteousness and the path of unrighteousness. And one of those things, if you're on the path of righteousness, is to free a slave. So we see that at the same time, Islam removed many things to do with slavery, but at the same time, it promoted heavily the freeing of slaves.
Right, that is part and parcel of Islam. And we'll as we get into the history of Islam and slavery, you'll see that one of the main reasons why there's no other way to put it. One of the main reasons there was a constant slave trade into the Muslim world was because of the demand for slaves, because Muslims kept freeing their slaves. Muslims kept emancipating or manumitting their slaves, or the Arab world, or really it's the Arab/Berber world of North Africa, constantly freed their slaves, creating a demand for slaves, creating the need to go back and down across the Sahara and bring in more slaves. So we'll get into that more as we talk about the history of it all. But yeah, freeing slaves is a big part of Islam. And even the whole terminology, I know this is not what we want to get into, so I don't want to go too deep into it. The terminology of what actually makes a slave. So here in the United States and maybe in other countries, we have prison work gangs. These are prisoners who have been convicted of a crime, and they are often not necessarily forced. This actually is considered a privilege in many cases. They have to do work for the state, fixing roads, digging ditches, breaking rocks, stuff like that. The term, the chain gang, comes from prisoners being chained up. Now, in modern time, they do get paid, but they get paid very, very little, below minimum wage, like a couple of dollars an hour. And in the past, many of them weren't paid at all. So I'm talking about even after slavery, they weren't paid at all. They were just forced to do that. So is the concept of slavery, how much different is that than a person who falls into debt? And this is not an Islamic concept, but a person who falls into debt and then is enslaved, or a person who is captured as a prisoner of war and then becomes a slave. You know, it's not much difference in that. So the whole terminology of slavery is very broad. So we have to be very careful. But I understand when most people think of slavery, they do think of people who are classified as property of another group of people or another person per se, and they're forced to do work for no pay in most cases, or very, very little pay in the best of cases. So I understand we have the classical definition of slavery, but that's a broad conversation. I don't want to get too deep into that because slavery in the Islamic world range very far. I'm not going to talk about too much about Turkey or actually the Ottoman Empire, but the Janissaries, who were slave warriors, were considered slaves. However, they were very powerful. And the Mamluks, before they became rulers, they could also become very powerful. They were slaves, but they could become literally rulers and become more powerful than their former masters. Now, that didn't happen too often with Black slaves. I think that's what we're going to talk about more. But in Sub-Saharan Africa, there were examples of slave warriors who rose to become rulers. Askia Muhammad, who was the ruler of the Songhai Empire, there's believed that he started off as a slave warrior who rose to become a general and then eventually became a ruler. So it could have, it's a very, I don't want to get too deep into it. I know it can be complicated, but the term, concept of slavery shouldn't just be molded by the traditional, the traditional view we have of African, people of African descent working the cotton fields in Alabama, and with an overseer on a horse with his whip ready to shoot or whip someone who moves too slow. That's the American way of doing things, and very much the Caribbean way as well. But it was different in many ways than in the Muslim world. There's some similarities, and we'll talk about that, but it's also different too.
Yeah, sure. I mean, just something that you touched upon, this chain game, or you mentioned, and I'm not sure if you watched this documentary. It's called The 13th. It's on Netflix, and it's in regards to the fact that the 13th Amendment itself had a loophole, because we see that when slavery was abolished, we saw in America the first prison boom, and how this continued and continued, where now you have basically whole industries where their manufacturing is products are produced within the within the prison system. And
right.
So some people are questioning now, because what you see is over time, even the definition of slavery or the moral way of looking at it is always changing, because maybe 30 years ago they never saw people in prisons who are paid next to nothing as slaves. While now there are discussions within Western thinkers in regards to, is this the same thing as slavery? So, okay, moving on, bro. So obviously we've spoken about the Islamic viewpoint on slavery and how it came and how it changed the situation for how slaves are understood. But there's one point I do want to mention, and this is important, I think, because you started off by saying that Islam doesn't prohibit slavery as such. Okay, it calls for the emancipation. And something that's important for the listeners to kind of pick up on is that the idea of abolition of slavery, it started very later on. It started, within the 17th century. And before then, within every sort of civilization or within history, it was not, there was, there may be emancipation and so on, but there's never actually a call for the abolition of slavery as a system. And this is really important, because what we do now is when we look back at and I think this is what you're alluding to, the fact that you can't just look at slavery and then apply the same template everywhere, because when we're looking at slavery, we're generally thinking about, like you said, the cotton pickers in Alabama or, in the South. And we're comparing that now and the treatment to generally this is what slavery was and this is how slaves were treated. But throughout time, this isn't the case. So, bro, moving on in regards to the historical aspect then of we've understood that Islam itself, its viewpoint on slavery, which encourages the freeing of slaves, even to expiate sins and whatnot. So this is a really virtuous action that one can do, very rewardable. However, in regards to the maybe the practical implementation of this historically, how did it play out?
Right. The first people to be, for lack of a better phrase, victims of Islamic slavery or Muslim slavery, maybe a better phrase, would probably have been the Persians. They were the Persians after the armies under Abu Bakr and then Umar, led by Khalid ibn Walid, anhum, and then Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, I believe. Once the Sassanid Empire in Persia fell, many of those inhabitants within that area became slaves of the conquering Arab armies, or conquering Muslim armies, who were primarily Arab. Over time, as the time of the righteous caliphs, the first four righteous caliphs of Islam passed and moved on into the Umayyad period, the concept changed a little bit, or the practice changed, where you still had many of these Persians who were slaves. Many of them converted to Islam, many of them were freed, many of them married Arabs, and once they became free, they became mawali or mawla, meaning they were basically free slaves. They were Muslim, but now they were still tied to the ruling Arab family or the family that had enslaved them before. The Umayyads, we're not going to get too deep into, but the Umayyads, they were not the righteous caliphs, obviously. They were very wasteful in their spending of money, and they needed a high tax revenue. And in Islam, we know that non-Muslims can be charged jizya, or the poll tax, and that was also required for the Umayyad dynasty to maintain their standard of living. So the Umayyads controlled which mawla, or which people could become Muslim or not, because they knew if these Persians, most of them were Persians, but also as they spread out into North Africa, you also have Berbers as well, and also Copts from Egypt, and even Greeks and Romans from Turkey, or what's now Anatolia in Syria, places like that. The Umayyads controlled or tried to limit how many of them could become Muslim, because then they couldn't charge them jizya any longer. And so the Umayyads kind of tried to control this. Those are the first people. Eventually, that led to the Abbasid revolution, and Umayyads overthrown, and the Abbasids kind of changed a lot of that stuff around and got a little bit better. This
quick point, brother. I've heard of the Mawali tax. But it's the first I'm sort of hearing that the those in authority would have tried to restrict people from. How could they do this? I don't.
Yeah, it was particularly during the time of Hajjaj ibn Yusuf, the Mawla, or the people who were free slaves, they were still connected to their former Arab families, or whoever ruled. They were still connected to them, but many of them, they had to get permission to become Muslim, basically. And that permission wasn't always given because the government needed that tax revenue. Of course, that's un-Islamic, that is wrong, but the Umayyad dynasty prevented, until, with the exception of Umar ibn Abdulaziz, he was the one who, for his 2 years of reign, he was the one who overturned that rule. But generally speaking, the Umayyads did not allow wholesale conversion to Islam. They controlled it, they limited it, because they needed that tax revenue to support their lifestyle, to support their army, to keep control. They wouldn't allow all of these free slaves to just accept Islam. It had to be done with either in different cases, either the governor's permission or their former master's permission, things like that. So it's a strange thing to hear. Fortunately, it's only about 100 years in our life, but there are other stories. In fact, I released a recent episode about the Sokoto Caliphate, which was in Africa, and these are African before the Sokoto Caliphate, before them, the empire or one of the kings who was Muslim before the Sokoto Caliphate came, he saw that the Muslims following the leader of this, I'm getting way into the story, but Uthman Dan Fodio was a famous sheikh who eventually founded the Sokoto Caliphate. One of the reasons he was a popular scholar during his period of time. He had a large following. His following was bringing in many people who were converting to Islam. To prevent his influence or to limit his influence, the Sultan at the time, who was a Black African Muslim, said that no one could convert to Islam any longer. And anybody who had converted and was from another religion had to go back to their former religion, because he was trying to prevent Uthman Dan Fodio's influence from coming too high. So this was an example of, and I just found this out last month when I was doing my research on the Sokoto Caliphate. So these are examples of rulers of the past, and Hajjaj ibn Yusuf did it. He prevented Muslims from fully accepting Islam or fully becoming Muslim and getting all the benefits of being Muslim, in order to keep that tax revenue coming in. This, in the time of the example I mentioned, Africa, that's for political reasons, but in the end, I guess it's all politics in the end. But going back to the original question, yeah, the Persians were perhaps the first people to come into Islam as slaves. From there, probably would be the Berbers next, as the Muslims pushed across North Africa. Many of the Berbers accepted Islam, and the Berbers were different. With conquering North Africa was much more difficult than the conquest of Persia, and so in many cases, the Arabs had to make deals and negotiations with the Berbers in order for them to not fight them so much. So there was a lot of negotiate. If you become Muslim and just accept us, then and accept the rule of the Caliph, we won't fight you. And so many Berbers came into Islam just through wholesale conversion, because they gave a lot more trouble to the Umayyads as they conquered North Africa. It wasn't always the case, and that's a very broad generalization because there's so many different groups of Berbers across North Africa. But the Berbers converted to Islam much quicker than other groups did. They accepted Islam much quicker. In fact, the Berbers, North Africans, were part of the main force pushing into Spain, what was now Spain, and all. And this is all during the Umayyad Caliphate, first 50 years of the Umayyad Caliphate. So this is so Berbers were very important with that. But as the Berbers became more Arabized, eventually well, I'm not sure if you're ready to go now to swoop down to where the Black people come in, where we get down to that part now. But that's basically how it started.
One quick point there, just to mention for the benefit of the listeners.
Sure.
These conquests were legitimate conquests. So the way these people are coming into this slavery, if that's what you want to call it, was legitimate according to Islam.
Yes, in the case of the Persians were conquered people. They were conquered, and the records from that time are very scarce. But if they follow the general pattern, in order to keep their life and their property, they would most likely have either become slaves and then perhaps quickly freed, but kept some sort of allegiance or ties with some ruling Arab noble or sharif or something like that. Or they would have been, if they did fight, maybe they were part of the army that fought, they got defeated, and then they would have been a slave, perhaps over a couple of years. Maybe they would have converted to Islam or done some great favor for whoever their master was, and then was freed or for whatever reason. But yeah, these early conquests, and even into North Africa, it was warfare. And this was, if the Arabs, if they were defeated, they would have been enslaved also or killed. And it happened throughout history as well. So those who were defeated, if their choices were, either die or become slaves. You can't just, if you conquer an army, you defeat the army, you don't let a bunch of well-trained soldiers just go back home. Not back then at least. Now we have, we have the Hague and the United Nations and all these things. You can kind of mediate that stuff. But back then, you didn't have all those things. So you just can't let a group of trained soldiers go back home after you defeat them. All they're going to do is regroup and fight you again. So to prevent that from happening, unfortunately, the intelligent or the practical way would be to either kill them or enslave them, take away their power. And most people would opt for slavery over death. in most
Yeah,
cases.
yeah. Exactly. But the point is though is that this was based on within the Islamic tradition, and this wasn't just raiding for the sake of slaves. This is something different.
Oh yeah. This is actual warfare. This was not raiding for the sake of slaves. This was warfare. The Byzantine Empire still controlled most of North Africa. The Muslims were in an active war against the Byzantine Empire. So fighting against them in North Africa, taking away property from land, territory from them in North Africa would have been a legitimate military objective to limit their ability to harm the Muslim Empire. So I'm not. Of course, there may have been some some selfish reasons for doing it. I'm sure there would have been local generals or governors who want to expand their power base and gain military strength or gain wealth, but it wasn't done for the sake of slaves. Absolutely not. It was done for they're in an active war with the Byzantines, and this was just a matter of expanding the territory and limiting the power and ability of their enemy.
But also, for the benefit of the listeners again, that what we see is when the Muslims were going on these conquests, in a way, this was the way the state would carry. This was just like its foreign policy of carrying Islam to other nations, because even before any warfare, there would have been talks, there would have been invitation to Islam. So the idea here wasn't enslavement; it was actually liberation of the people, and only those people who would have been enslaved were those who had resisted. And in fact, that would not be the populace, would it? That would really be people linked to
right.
the authorities, because it's the authorities they fought. They never fought the people.
Right. This is especially true during the time of the righteous caliphs. During the Umayyads kind of went off, and they sometimes broke a lot of rules and broke a lot of conventions. The Umayyads were far from perfect, but during the time of the righteous caliphs, particularly Abu Bakr, Omar, and then a little bit on to Uthman, yes, generally speaking, the Muslim general will go to the ruler or leader of that area, invite them to Islam, and almost always, the people of that region would have been considered slaves of that non-Muslim king or ruler over there. He would have been considered slaves of that king. The king, in most cases, would refuse and resist. He would be defeated, and then him and his family, if they were left alive, their property and their lives would now go to the conquering Muslim army. And so this is how some of these conquering Arabs obtained large tracts of land, because they defeated the nobility and the ruling families that ruled in this area. So they would acquire all of this property, as well as the people who worked those property, if they were a feudal state. In many cases, they were feudal states. But the Muslims rarely attacked general populations, especially during the times of the righteous caliphs. It was mostly just against the leadership. And once the leadership was broken or defeated, then the Muslims would usually hire locals to continue running the government on their behalf.
Yeah.
And they'll move on to the next place. And so, from a Muslim perspective, I can understand maybe the local people or the local government could see them as invaders. But from the Muslim perspective, this was, for one thing, spreading Islam, but also a form of self-defense, because all of these armies that were surrounding the very small and fractured, I'll say weak, I won't say fractured, the very small and weak Muslim Khilafah, particularly after Abu Bakr had just put down the wars of rebellion, wars of apostasy. The Muslim world was a little weak and fragile at the time. It would have been a great moment for the Romans or the Persians to swoop in and turn some of these former rebels against the Muslims. And so it was a war strategy. I do kind of sometimes put things in practical means and practical manner, but it would have been definitely an Islamic perspective, Islamic strategy to help spread Islam, but also for practical matters to protect your borders, to expand your borders and weaken your enemies, because the Romans and the Persians were looking to capitalize on the recently defeated rebellion that Abu Bakr had just put down. That's why as soon as the Ridda wars were ended, Abu Bakr immediately began to push on into what's now considered Iraq, and then to the west into what is now considered Syria, really Jordan, more than Syria.
Yeah. So I think you were gonna go now a bit south in the
Okay.
in Africa.
Okay. Now, with when it comes to Sub-Saharan Africa, um, Black Africa, however people want to call it, this is where, now this is of course long after the Umayyads are gone, the Abbasids are now in control. So now you have Muslim leaders and rulers. Muslim world is first of all very fractured by now. By the time Islam starts creeping down into Sub-Saharan Africa, the Umayyads are gone. The Abbasids are still around, but they're much weaker. There are lots of smaller Arabized or Arab/Berber kingdoms across North Africa. And between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa is, of course, the Sahara Desert. And this has always played as a huge barrier between these two groups. Where not for the camel, it would have been very difficult. It would have been impossible for these two groups to have any sort of interaction. But there was interaction. There was warfare between, this is talking about before Islam.
Is it probably why the Romans or the Byzantines didn't venture down south, or?
Yeah, the Romans and the Byzantines after them, and I think the Vandals between them, they mostly stayed along the coast of North Africa, particularly in Tunisia. Of course, Egypt was always pretty popular, but even over to the west, down to what's now North Morocco, Algeria, places like that, and Libya as well. The Romans and the Byzantines, they generally stayed along the coast. For one, there is first a range of mountains, I think it's called the Atlas Mountains. And then we have this huge desert, which the entire continent of the United States can fit inside of, with space to spare. So there's a huge desert there that it prevents humans from crossing through on foot. It was only the camel that allows people to go through, and even then, it's very, very dangerous. And by the time Islam came through, there were designated routes. There were oases, spaces to refuel, or well, not refuel, but water up and rest and things like that. So, but even then, it was still a very dangerous affair to try to cross that Sahara Desert, even with camels, even with proper preparation and well-known path. It was not easy to do it, and very, very difficult to bring an entire army through. Nearly impossible until very late in human history, say maybe around the 13th, 14th, 15th century, before armies could come through there. And even then, they had to go a roundabout way through Morocco, not straight through, like through Libya or anything like that. They had to go around through Morocco to come down into Africa. As far as being an army is concerned, individual caravans and people could do that. Now, one of the accusations against Islam is that Islam is spread by the sword. Fun fact, not true. There are very few, I can't think of any of the major Muslim nations below the Sahara Desert, that sub-Saharan Muslim nations that were brought into Islam by force. I'm trying to think of any. I can't think of any right now off the top of my head.
So what sort of areas, what sort of countries you talking about? Nigeria, Niger?
Nigeria, Niger, Senegal, Gambia, Chad, these places. Now you get over to the east, Ethiopia. Ethiopia is still majority Christian. Somalia. There weren't really conquests there either. But well, let me see. Now there were Black Muslims who conquered Black non-Muslims and brought Islam there, but not Arab conquering armies. So there were quite a few Muslim empires who were Black Muslim empires who conquered a whole lot of people, and they brought Islam through. I won't say they brought Islam through force, but they brought these lands into their territory by force. So that did happen, but it was not conquering Arab armies coming down and forcing the Black people to accept Islam. The way these Islam came into Sub-Saharan Africa in most cases was through trade and marriage. Usually trade led to marriage.
Okay.
Berber or Arab merchants, they would come down across the Sahara, start doing business in the African kingdoms that are already established, particularly in Ghana. Now, we say the Empire of Ghana, we're not talking about the modern nation of Ghana. The modern state of Ghana is nowhere near the original Empire of Ghana. But they would come down and do business there. Eventually, some of them may stay. Some of these Arab or Berber merchants would stay and just settle down there, and they'll marry a local African woman, start having children, and his children would become Muslim. And eventually, over time, he may convince a few people to accept Islam. And over time, little pockets of little Muslim communities would sprout up within these African kingdoms, these small African kingdoms. Over time, the African Muslims, particularly the Empire of Ghana, the African Muslims became more and more critical to operations of the state because the African Muslims had one major advantage: they could write. Being able to, they learn how to read and write Arabic, and being able to write, and that is an important skill for the function of any government. So very often you may have a non-Muslim African king or emperor, but almost his entire administration, or much of it, would be run by Muslims who could write because they had that. Also, Muslims had rules of business. There are Islamic rules of business that we have to follow. And so they also, because people tended to prefer to do business with them because whether you like the rules or not, at least you knew what to expect. Whereas people who don't have rules, you don't know what you're going to get. So you actually knew what to expect with the Muslims. So many of them grew powerful through the government, grew powerful through trade and through business. Over time, eventually, you wound up with a Muslim emperor. So the Empire of Ghana was probably one of the first Muslim empires in West Africa to go from non-Muslim to Muslim, and it went through a completely peaceful process, as far as I'm aware of.
You're non-Muslim. When you say non-Muslim, what was it like? Some local?
The overall term for the various different African beliefs that originate in Africa is generally called TAR, traditional African religions. So it's very difficult to put them all in one group, and they have various different beliefs. I don't want to use the word paganism because they weren't all pagans. That's what we consider pagans, someone who worships a bunch of idols. They weren't all like that. We could probably say from a Muslim perspective, I say Mushrikin. We could definitely say Mushrik. But the English word pagan or polytheist doesn't quite fit all of them all the time. Some of them did ancestor worship, some of them did not. Some of them did what's considered animism, which is kind of like worshiping the spirits that exist in trees and different rocks and stuff like that. So I don't want to throw the word pagan on them, but I will say that often group, and this is also kind of outdated term as well. Traditional African religion is somewhat outdated, but it's the best term that I can think of right now.
Okay.
And it is, these are religions that originated in Africa and not from either Arabia as far as Islam is concerned, or from Europe as far as Christianity is concerned. So these non-Muslim empire, particularly Ghana, eventually became Muslim. Now, by the time they became Muslim, the economy has shifted. Before that, Ghana was very particular. Ghana made a lot of money off of gold and salt trade. Salt was very important for preservation and for food, things like that. And gold has always been important in human society. But by the time the government had become Muslim, their fortunes had changed. And so now Ghana began to try to expand by force in order to keep itself relevant by this time. And this meant going to war with some of its neighbors. And his neighbors were generally not Muslim. When they were defeated, they acquired slaves, and now they have a new source of income. And so that, I won't say that was the beginning of the slave trade, because there was slavery going on even before that. And even before Islam, there was some slave trade going on between North Africa and Sub-Saharan Africa, back and forth. But with the expansion of some of these, with expanding warfare, particularly in West Africa, that kind of kicked into gear, because now you have a bunch of POWs and you have to do something with them. And that's how slavery, that's the one way how slavery began in Sub-Saharan Africa. Now, slavery only exists with a demand. There has to be someone who wants those slaves. Now, the Muslim African empires went through several stages: Ghana, the Mali, and Songhai. In all cases, though, the Muslims generally controlled that region between where the Sahara Desert ends and the Sub-Saharan Africa begins, the part where people can start living, particularly around the Niger River, where it becomes habitable for human existence. With the abundance of POWs and slaves now, there was a constant back and forth movement of Black Muslim empires or Black Muslim or rulers or kingdoms fighting and defeating non-Muslim neighbors and taking those POWs and shipping them up north. Now, there were also cases of, in some cases, a few Berbers and Arabs coming down also, but they did some raiding. I can't say they didn't do any raiding, but for the most part, usually the Arabs or Berbers from North Africa came to Africa, bought slaves off of the Muslim African rulers, and then just transported them back across the Sahara.
So, quick question.
And,
quick question at this
sure.
stage, Brother Muttaqi. When we're talking about the slave trade, it seems like a business, right? But when you're saying that the Ghana Empire, because of its economic situation, had to expand. So even at this stage, the slaves, they are the natural outcome of the warfare, which primary reason is to conquest and to boost up your economy, right? So, however, it wasn't like they were fighting these nations in order to enslave them specifically for that reason and then boost their economy on the slaves.
Not yet. That happened several hundred years later. Eventually did get to that point. But also remember, it's happening the other way around. The Muslims didn't win every battle. So when the Muslims lost battles, their conquered POWs became slaves for the non-African Muslims. So.
But I guess also it's like, if people just think about the movie Gladiator, I can't remember the main actor. Russell Crowe, that's it. If you think about it, in those days, because it was really good, because you keep calling it POW, and that's actually what they are, in the sense like there was a battle, and the people that now who are defeated, you have to do something with them. You have to do something with them. So you then, their authority, their power is gone. So you've now enslaved them, and then you do what you need to, whether they serve people in their homes, or whether now, because there is a trade going on, you sell the slave and you make some money from it. But I think it's like, what we have to understand is in throughout time, I think maybe later on, and I'm sure you're going to get to it, where maybe it became the incentive of actually going to war in order to get slaves. But I think before this time, generally, the slaves were the outcome of the war rather than the reason for the war.
That's true. In the beginning, particularly, these empires were expanding. Mali became a huge empire. We all hear the story of Mansa Musa making his great Hajj, and you talk about all the gold he had, he also had thousands of slaves with him too. And those slaves were generally conquered people. And most of the cases was POWs, true, but once it was just like when the Arabs conquered Persia. Once you conquer that land, technically, the conquering army could do whatever they wanted with those people. Sometimes they freed them, depending on how belligerent they were. They may have enslaved them as well, depending on what the needs were at that time. You're talking about hundreds of years of fighting, warfare, society. It's very difficult to say only one thing.
Point I want to make, I want to ask you, because I think this needs to be made clear, is that when the Muslims went to war, so just say now they have besieged a city, okay, and the leader, the authority has declined the offer, so now basically it's jihad fi sabilillah, and it's basically you would be the conqueror. When we're talking about the slaves, okay, would they consist of the people who you fought, or do they consist of the population? Now, what I mean is, like, now, just say now, for example, Damascus is conquered. Even though Damascus, there was a funny thing that happened between the two companions. But just say another city. It wasn't like as if the Muslim soldiers were going house by house and taking the people because now they are their slaves. You know what I'm trying to say? It's like, where do you draw the line? Who is it that you enslave? Is it the people you fought? Or now, if that whole city falls, basically every single person within the city can be enslaved.
Right. That would often depend on the circumstance. I wish I could give you a single answer, but there is no single answer often. Sometimes if it was a hard-fought battle and a long siege that lasted several months or even a year, then once those walls fell and that city was conquered, in many cases, it was a tradition, in many cases where the general will allow 3 days of pillaging. Now, I don't know if that comes from Islam or from tradition. I don't know where that comes from. So I don't remember the Prophet allowing anything like that to happen. So that may have just been a tradition that just developed. But they allowed 3 days of pillaging. And during that period of time, people could be captured. But usually you don't have so much land you can cover on foot within 3 days without mass transit like we have today. So you are right in that everybody would not be enslaved. No, that usually was not the case. Those 3 days after the war fell, after the walls fell and the city was conquered, that could be a time where civilians may have been conquered or captured and put as slaves. And also remember that back then, often people went to war with their women folk, with their wives and stuff with them as well. Their wives came along with them. And once the armies fell, the army was defeated, that's the women who were there could often be captured, were often captured.
Yeah,
and,
sure.
and in many ways, they were part of the army itself. They provided nursing, they provided food, and they helped heal the warriors after they were injured. So they were part of the whole army apparatus.
In fact,
they could be considered.
In fact, many times the reason why the women folk were there and the children was to motivate the men that if you fall, we're gone. That's how it was.
Exactly. So oftentimes people who were not considered combatants were brought into the field of battle by their men who were in the military. So it did happen. Bottom line is, most cases, the people who became slaves in the Muslim world were done through actions of military action. But there were many cases where either unscrupulous Muslim businessmen or maybe just rulers who want to expand their territory, or people who just needed money, they would sometimes attack people who they were not fighting with, people who didn't have any war with. They would go ahead and fight them and sometimes acquire slaves in that manner. There is and as far as the slave trade is concerned itself, the actual slave trade, the actual business of slavery, there is no way to forcefully transport people across several miles of desert in a nice way, at least before the creation of the invention of the train and cars and stuff like that. Back then, the slave trade is by nature brutal. Whether it's going across the Atlantic Ocean or going across the Sahara, slave trade itself is brutal no matter what. And Muslims who participate in the slave trade and those who, however they got their slaves, or their POWs or free raiding, but most of them, like I said, were POWs or defeated enemies, if they weren't necessarily actual combatants. Either way, that transit from Africa or Sub-Saharan Africa to North Africa was where many of them died and where most of the brutality happened within the Islamic slave trade, so to speak. That's where most of the brutality happened. Just like the worst part for the transatlantic slave trade was going across the Atlantic Ocean. That's where most of the brutality happened, going across the Atlantic Ocean. It was no different with the Muslim world either. That part was the worst part. However, the biggest difference between Islamic slavery or slavery in the Muslim world and slavery in the West was once the slaves actually wound up with their final household, or actually wound the treatment of slaves within the Muslim world was much better, way, way better than the treatment of slaves in the non-Muslim world. You can say that slavery is slavery, that's true, but there is a big difference between the way slaves are treated in the Muslim world and the way slaves are treated in the non-Muslim world. And that's an important thing to make.
Yeah, well, that's something that I want to ask you about anyway. But after you've explained,
I know I just jumped a little bit. I know.
Yeah, because that's a really important point. That is, we need to highlight that. So going back to the Ghana empire and Mali and so on. And I think you say now they're basically they're expanding. Okay,
yeah, they're expanding. They're gravitating slaves, and now also there's a demand for slavery. The idea that there's all this huge population, because the Arabs and Berbers of North Africa, they saw Sub-Saharan Africa as this huge, gigantic landmass with millions upon millions of people. And they were right, they were, but they knew that they could acquire slaves from there. And they could also get them from the Europeans across the Mediterranean. That required warfare. They could easily capture slaves from the Muslims below the Sahara Desert. And so that created demand. Now, this is where it's going to blend into what I just said about the treatment of slaves in a way. In the Americas, the majority of slaves, especially in the beginning, were men. They needed men to work the fields, whether the sugarcane fields in the Caribbean or the cotton and rice fields in the Americas. They preferred men. However, in the Arab world, the preference was for women. Women slaves were more desired because they were mostly domestic workers. And also, let's be honest, concubines as well. They were mostly desired for those two reasons. Mostly domestic workers, but domestic workers, they will all often become concubines as well, which is why very few Arab countries, Arab nations today, you don't really have a large Black population. You have that in the Americas, in the United States, and in some parts of South America. You have that in the Caribbean, definitely. If all of these millions upon millions of Africans were shipped across the Sahara Desert, why don't you have large pockets of African or African descent communities? You have a few. I know there's a few. But you don't really.
Shall I tell you why? Not this is not the reason why. This is not the reason why, but this is what's alleged. And it's really important that you make that point, because I came across something which at that time I thought, I can't see why they're making this point. But what you just explained there, I think accounted to it from those people who tried to show that the Arabs moved between 17 to 18 million Africans to the Arab lands, is because the men were castrated. And like I said,
I have heard that. Yeah.
I've not come across this from any Muslim authority. And I looking at the way just the Islam itself, it doesn't. I need to probably do a bit more research on this, but it doesn't add up. However, what you've said there is a valid point. Why don't you see so many people? And I think maybe it's a case where that's a question that the people accusing Muslims have also thought, and the easy answer would be, well, they all got castrated.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to castrate millions of people at a time.
17, 18 million people.
Yeah, it's kind of hard to castrate. And these would have been defeated warriors. These would not have been weak men. These would have been men who were able to survive transit across the Sahara. These would have been former warriors, who have been strong men. They wouldn't just, the castration, I guess it's possible, but that would be a huge enterprise. And I think there would be, now of course they were eunuchs, but usually eunuchs were created as boys, as little boys. That's when they were usually created, not generally grown men. No, the reason why they weren't, you just said the Arabs preferred, the Arabs, you can look at the geography of North Africa, and it tells you everything. There are no plantations in North Africa. You're not going to grow cotton in North Africa, not back then. It hardly ever rained. It didn't have the geography and the temperature for huge plantations where chattel slavery was required. The slaves are brought, they were bought for usually three things: domestic work, as I mentioned, working in some manual labor, like working the docks, building things, construction, stuff like that, and then purchase or repurchase or resell in other places. So they will often sell them sometimes often into Europe. So the Europeans were often complicit in the same thing. It wasn't just the Arabs. The Europeans also bought Black slaves from the Arabs as well, and the North Africans as well, on into Europe. So those are the three general destinations for the Black slaves coming across there. But by and large, the vast majority, especially up until the 1700s or so, most of them were required. Most of the people that were required were women. Females were more desired for domestic work. Often they became concubines, sometimes even wives. And one big difference between the Muslim world and the European world, or the American world, is that in Islam you can't enslave your children. That just doesn't happen. That's inconceivable for a Muslim to enslave his own child. That just doesn't work. In the United States, very often the white master would enslave one of his would impregnate one of his slaves, and his child would remain a slave, which is
Well, look at
bizarre to me.
Thomas Jefferson.
Exactly. He had several of his own children as slaves. I mean, that's inconceivable in the Muslim world. In the Muslim world, if a man does have a concubine who's a slave, his children are born free. And that's just it. Now, and those go back into the fiqh. There are some fiqh rules that say if a slave marries another slave and they have children, the child is also a slave as well. That's different. But in most cases, the free man would marry or just impregnate his female slave, but the child would be free. Which is why you have, in some cases, emperors whose mothers were slaves. In some parts of the Muslim world, emperors, powerful men whose mothers were slaves, but their father was the emperor or the king. That happened countless times again, because in Islam you can't enslave your own children, which to me is bonkers that that even happened in the United States. It just doesn't make any sense. But that's one of the reasons why you don't have these large Black communities, is because the child was born half Black, half Arab, or half Black, half Berber, and then he or she became part of the society, and he was free, and he went on about his life. And so that created the rules of Islam. Often created a demand for slaves. There's kind of the irony of it is that there were so many ways to free slaves, and Muslims did free so many of their slaves. The average lifespan for a slave in the Muslim world is estimated at about 7 years. By lifespan, I don't mean like they died. Now, of course, some did die from disease and sickness, perhaps even from mistreatment. But as often as those things happen, a slave generally stopped being a slave within 7 years. Either they got freed by the master, or they got married, and then that lineage of slaves will be cut off, and so that would create a demand for slaves. So one number that I read was that there's a 15%. The slaves in the Muslim world, every year they had to replenish their slave population by 15% because they just couldn't keep their slave population up. Whereas in the United States and the Caribbean, particularly in the United States, the slave population was allowed to procreate because it's considered, there they were really treated like how you would treat cattle, horses. If you want more horses, bring in a stallion to impregnate a mare, and you get more horses. And so in the United States, slaves were treated in much the same way. In the Muslim world, I'm not saying it was perfect. By no means, slavery is generally a humiliating affair, no matter who does it or how it's done. But still, the treatment of slaves within the Muslim world was better. And the very fact that, we didn't have, well, not we, but there were no large plantations in the Muslim world. They didn't have a need for large fields in some parts. Now, there were some parts in Iraq, there were some, but I'm talking about just in North Africa, there wasn't a need for large slave populations to do heavy work. And the slaves were often not slaves anymore within 7 years, within less than a decade.
Yeah, no, exactly. I mean, even we know that one of the categories for zakat is, to pay to a slave in order to work towards his treatment. Also, we know another rule of Islam where if the slave wanted to make a deal with the master in order to get his freedom, then I think at the time of Umar ibn Khattab, I think it was him, he said, like, look, this has to happen. The master has to honor this. So you know what? That makes sense what you're saying, because if people are becoming free, then you need someone to replace to do that work, right?
Right.
So now it kind of makes sense, because that's what I'm saying to you. Because when you're thinking about slavery, again, you think of 12 years a slave, or you're thinking about, that movie, or you're thinking about all these things, and but in reality, they did many different types of jobs. It wasn't just whip in the fields, So moving on, bro, we could obviously, I'm not sure if you want to give some more juicy information in regards to the sort of slave trade, but I think from what you're saying is, when it was happening in Africa, there were Muslim rulers who were, profiting from this trade. However, it was also non-Muslims that were doing the same. It was just something which was done. Certainly from, we see warfare. And I think the important point really at this stage is we started off with the fiqh of the Islamic viewpoint on slavery, And there are many things like you mentioned, even the fact that, you know, the children of the slave woman to her master are born free, and then when the master dies, she's made free. So we see that there's loads of things happening there which changed the complete dynamics of how slavery was understood. But what we do see from your examples is that, you know, and we see today, is that you have Islam and then you have the way Muslims behave, and they're not always in sync. You know, so we see that there were cases, like you're saying, where there was a demand, and you know, those people had to come from somewhere, and unfortunately, you know, a lot of this was being manipulated, raids. But I think it's important also to acknowledge that even still, even from just say the Muslims in North Africa, a lot of them, would you not say that they were buying the slaves? I.e., their participation in this whole slave trade, if you want to call it that, was that they were buying it. Were they also were they also involved in the trade as sellers as well on a large scale, or was it mostly they were involved in the purchasing part?
They're definitely on both sides of it. For one, and they did do some raiding, particularly in the areas going towards East Africa. There were some Arabs and Berbers who raided some parts of East Africa, and they weren't even at war. In fact, they were actually Muslim countries or Muslim states that they raided. But these were exceptions, not the rule. Like I say, Muslims don't always follow the rules of their own faith. And so there were in East Africa, or going towards East Africa, like in Chad, Nigeria, places like that, where Berbers would come down from Libya and raid Muslim states and carry Muslims away as slaves. So that did happen, but that was the exception, not the rule. As far as the actual business side of it, yeah, there were definitely there were always intermediaries. There were always middlemen, slavers, however you want to call it, or slave traders, however you want to call them. So once the slaves are brought to, say, Timbuktu or some state or some city that was right on the edge of the Sahara Desert, then the trade will happen, and they'll go from the hands of the Africans to the hands of the Muslim Africans to the hands of the Muslim Arabs / Berbers, and then they'll be transported across the Sahara Desert, taken to North Africa, and then the slave trade will happen again. They'll be cleaned up and everything. Those who survived the trans-Sahara trip, they'll be cleaned up and then sold off into slavery from there. Sometimes, however, they were resold on into Europe, particularly in Spain. And not just when the Muslims controlled Spain, but also when the Muslims didn't control Spain. They also traded up into the parts of Iberia that had been reconquered by the Christians, and also into Italy as well. And not so far as north as Britain, that was very rare, but definitely the parts of the Mediterranean area, South France, Spain, Iberia, Italy, Sicily, those places received a lot of Black slaves being resold by Muslims in North Africa. And so that did happen often. Now, when it comes to transatlantic slave trade, that's more complicated. There were very, very few Muslim Arabs involved in the transatlantic slave trade. I haven't heard of any of them yet. The transatlantic slave trade was a purely African affair, except for the European part, of course. But the slaves were often brought from either, it could be either Muslim or non-Muslim. They were both parties were involved, but the population of that area was mostly non-Muslim. So most of that slave trade that goes across the Atlantic was happening between non-Muslim rulers or kings or whomever who had slaves, and their slaves could have been either been people who were in debt, people who were captured in warfare, however many means they got their slaves. And then they sold them off to the Europeans, and Europeans took them across the Atlantic Ocean. There were some Muslims involved in that also, but Muslims were also slaves in that as well. Muslims were both slaves, but it was not as common for Muslims to be involved in the slave trade, but there were some. I mean, there had to have been some, but the vast majority were non-Muslim Africans selling other Africans. And be clear there, I want to make sure people understand that let's not think of Africa as one monolith. Africa has thousands of different ethnicities. So just like French and German people, that divides them is a line in the dirt. That's what divides France and Germany. But they still consider themselves two separate people. Same thing. So these Africans were not necessarily selling their brothers, so to speak. They were selling another group of people who they might have been at war with or had a feud with or whatever, things like that. They did not consider them their quote unquote brothers. They considered them their enemy or their rival in most cases.
Yeah. I mean, from what some reading I did at the time, there were actually, I can't think of any names right now, but there were even African scholars who were working to stop certainly Muslim slaves being sold to the Europeans at that time. So, just to make it clear as well that, because let's move on to the transatlantic slave trade and also then sort of like bring in the question of, the difference between that slavery, the way people are treated and in just say the Muslim world. But just to make it clear, the Europeans, they purchased these slaves from Africans. They didn't actually go and raid and take the slaves, did they?
In most cases, that's true, yes. There were some cases of Europeans doing raiding, but that was the exception, not the rule. It was just much easier to just buy them from the existing groups that are already there. There were some Muslims involved in that part because there were Muslim empires there. They were by the time the transatlantic slave trade was really getting into gear, the Muslim empires of West Africa were gone or weak and falling apart and fighting, and they were really fractured by then. But they still have some, and so just off of coast of Senegal, there was a slave port right there. Now in the very early stages, there were some Portuguese who tried to raid into the West African coastland to try to raid and capture people. But at that time, the military technology between the Europeans and the Africans were about the same. And the Africans were still, the African kingdoms at that period of time were strong enough to fight the Portuguese off and chase them away. Over time, the imbalance changed, but even then, the Europeans generally found it easier to just buy slaves off of the Africans that already existed there because they already had an inbuilt market. Now, after the West African empires began to fracture and fall apart, this, of course, led to warfare. And with more warfare and more fracturing, lots of fighting came. And this is not just in the Muslim world, in the Muslim parts of Africa, also in the non-Muslim parts of Africa. There's lots of fighting going on, lots of division and fracturing apart, leading to more POWs and allow the Europeans to set up a whole bunch of slave forts all across West Africa, starting from Senegal, going all the way down to the south to what's known as Bight of Biafra, what's now Benin, Nigeria, Togo, places like that, all the way through down to, I think as far south as Cameroon and Congo and places like that. So it allowed the Europeans to create all these slave forts. And most of these places were not Muslim territory, by the way. Most of these places now were some of them had converted to Christianity, and there were actually some Christian slave traders, African Christian slave traders. There were some there as well. And there are also many Africans who follow traditional African religions who did slave trading as well, from just fighting with other Africans. And of course, the European demand fueled all of this division and anarchy in the first place. There are instances where, with one thing, slaves will often be traded for guns and weapons so that the local African governments could, of course, fight against their enemies and perpetuate the cycle. There was a few cases where, I think this might have been a Muslim as well, where some of the African Muslims tried to organize and try to refuse to sell slaves to the Europeans. But the Europeans said, if you don't give it to us, we'll sell these guns to your enemy instead. And sometimes they deliberately sometimes just gave guns to their enemy, so the enemy tribe, well, I don't say enemy tribe, that's probably the wrong word, so the enemy African state could fight the Muslim African state. I think acquire slaves.
There was this one, you probably know, I can't remember the name now. There was a certain area where there were Muslims. I think they may have been maybe at some stage slaves, but they set up the kingdom of Futuar or something like this, where basically they were against the enslavement and selling to Europeans. And what eventually happened was that the Europeans sided with the enemies surrounding them and took them out.
Right. I think that was in part of Senegal. I want to say, I'm going to get it wrong. If I think of it wrong, I'm going to get the wrong name. But I know I've heard that story also. It's a book. I could probably give it to you if you want to include the links. And there's a book that I would suggest people read, as far as if you want to know about the Muslim African resistance to slavery. That when they try, I can't remember off the top of my head. It's written by a French African woman from Senegal. I believe she was Muslim, but I'll bring it up. I don't remember the name now, but I can bring it up. Give the link to it later on. But yeah, that was definitely true. There were Muslims who tried to resist it, but there was too much anarchy. They were too weak. The Europeans, by a certain period of time, the European technology was greater than the African technology as far as weapons were concerned, and so they were able to continuously somehow or another maneuver the Africans against each other to keep that slave rail going.
They've always been good at that.
So yeah, so that kept the wheel going. So, and there's some estimates somewhere between 13 to 25% of all the slaves came to the Americas were Muslim. In fact, many of the early, before the American Revolution, before the United States became the United States, when still had 13 colonies and the Europeans were still colonizing North America, there was actually more of a demand for Muslim slaves, because the Muslim slaves, generally those who came from West Africa, whether it was Mali or Senegal, places like that, Gambia, they already had knowledge of cultivation. They already had knowledge of ironworking. They had all this knowledge already. So there's a high demand for slaves from these regions that were predominantly Muslim. So places like Louisiana in the southern United States had a large. It was first colonized by the French, then eventually came over to the English, and then to the French, and then to the Americas. But before that happened, there's also some Spanish down there as well. But generally speaking, Louisiana is to the mouth of the Mississippi River, and so it was really valuable for rice cultivation. And rice grew in Africa for centuries, and so Africans already knew how to cultivate rice, and especially in the Muslim regions. And if you go to rice is a staple food in many parts of the Muslim world, but if you go to West Africa now, rice is still a staple food in Africa, in West Africa, in the Muslim parts of West Africa. And it was here the same way. So there was a demand for Muslim slaves here. And if you go down into Brazil, there were actually, I had to do some more research on, there were actually a rebellion against, a Muslim slave rebellion against the colonizers in that region. I don't have too much details on it, so don't have too many questions about it. But that happened because of Muslims. And even in the Americas, there was, in Louisiana as well, there was a slave revolt, can't remember his name right now, that was led by a Muslim slave, a Muslim African slave. I can't remember the name right now. It'll come to me eventually. But yeah, there was a point in time where Muslims were it wasn't necessarily they wanted Muslims per se, they just wanted people from a certain region. And that region just happened to have a lot of Muslims.
But you mentioned a large percentage there. So I mean, did they eventually be did they have to convert, or because that doesn't reflect the sort of black population in America in regards to Muslims, is it, number wise?
Right. Those early Africans who came over here who were Muslim and were enslaved. Now, bear in mind that most of the Africans who came here, many of them would have been warriors. Whether Muslim or non-Muslim, many of them would have been warriors. So they would have been, if they had survived the whole slave trade and then coming across the Atlantic Ocean, they would have been the strongest of the strongest. They would have been, so they would have been pretty physically fit. And then you have the Muslims who have the knowledge as well.
So now, what sort of percentage, because what you're saying is that the journey itself was probably the hardest part. I mean, what was the percentage like off the top of your head? Like, is it like 50% or?
Yeah, I've heard attrition rates as high as 50%. That there was some. that they could expect. They basically calculated into their accounting of the slave trade that at least 50% of their wares, of their merchandise, will not make it across the Atlantic Ocean. And there were rules put in place to try to mitigate that and humanize it and all, but those are, for the most part, ignored. It was a business enterprise, and there was almost no way to really regulate that back then. It'd be very difficult to regulate it now. There's almost no way to regulate back then either. So, but there were, as far as those early Muslims who were enslaved in the United States, I don't know much about the Caribbean, the Muslims who came into the Caribbean, but as far as the United States is concerned, the Muslims who came here, many of them would have tried to hold on to their faith as long as they could. They would have been careful. The establishment, the dominant society, so to speak, would have been careful not to allow them to congregate for so much, not to allow them to, definitely would have been no praying in congregation, none of that sort of stuff. That would have been too much of a threat. Have a bunch of people speaking the same language you don't understand praying together, and you know, that would have been a threat. It would have been very difficult for them to hold on to their faith. They may have tried. So you're just talking about, first of all, they could probably track the moon phases to know when it's Ramadan, the time to fast and stuff like that. Maybe they could have done that. Maybe they would have tried maybe to sneak in their prayers when they could, but eventually they would have to marry or have a child, or you know, and the society did not prevent that. Actually wanted it because it brought them more slaves naturally, and so it would have been very unlikely for Islam to carry on to the next generation, even if that first generation had. Now there are lots of slave narratives of, and actually, I mean, I have too many things in my head, but I'll get to them in a second. There are lots of slave narratives of second generation and third generation slaves talking about seeing their grandparents face the east and pray to the east, and praying with beads and things like this. And there are, because understand, by the slave trade ended in the United States. When I say the slave trade, the transatlantic slave trade ended in the United States in the early 1800s. The Constitution outlawed about 1812. I can't remember, 1810, something like that. I think 1820 maybe. So they outlawed the import of new African slaves about the early 1800s. Slavery ended with the Civil War in 1864, 1865. So you have about 40 years. So there is enough time there for people to know their Muslim, or to have seen their Muslim grandparents or parents, maybe even trying to practice their religion. But it would have been very hard for it to have survived beyond 1 or 2 generations. And there are even the Library of Congress. You go to the Library of Congress website. There's a brother named Saeed Ibn, I can't remember his last name, but he wrote a whole, they were surprised because of his white masters and the white people who controlled the society at that time. They were surprised to see this man who they thought was a slave, right? He wrote his whole manuscript, all this stuff about how he became a slave, about his life as a slave, and how his life as it was in Africa. It's all in the Library of Congress. Saeed Ibn, I can't remember his last name right now. Now, he said that he converted to Christianity in his manuscript. It's all written in Arabic, by the way. You can read it. You can see him praising Allah, praising the Prophet Muhammad, and it's all there written and everything. Though he says he had converted to Christianity, you know, because he starts off with Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim and things like that. It's hard to really believe that, because maybe he was just saying that just to survive. That could have been very likely. Allah knows best. I don't know what nobody could tell what his heart was at that time, but still, he wrote about his life in Africa before he was taken slave. He wrote about how he came over to the Americas and all. So, and like I said, it's Library of Congress. It's all digitized. Anyone wants to go see it. But in most cases, it would have been hard to keep Islam going. There is one thing I wanted to mention though. There's in the southern United States, it's not as much in practice now, but there was a practice amongst Africans called ring and shout. It's a bit of a tradition. It's a kind of a Christian thing where Black people would sing gospel music and walk around in a circle, and there'll be maybe one person maybe playing a guitar or playing some sort of instrument, kind of leading the whole chant and the whole ceremony. And it's called ring and shout, something along those lines. It's not so much in practice now, but you can still find videos of it online. That practice is a direct result from things happening in Africa, not only from non-Muslim Africans, but also from Sufi Africans as well. You can go now and watch videos of African Muslim Sufis doing similar things where there's still one single person leading the chant. Now, of course, they're doing dhikr. We call it dhikr now, not gospel. They'll be doing dhikr, all dressed in white, just like over here in the United States, and moving in a counterclockwise circle as they dhikr and chant. Or in the United States, it was singing gospel music, but still, that's a direct result of this tradition coming from Sufi Islam. And maybe it existed in the non-Muslim areas as well, but I know for certain it existed in Sufi circles in Africa as well. And that came over here in the United States. It's not so much in practice now, but in certain parts of the United States as well, where the slave or the African society or the Black society was more isolated from the main group of the main society, you'll see a lot more of these African and even some Islamic traditions persist even further. For instance, there are some islands off the coast of South Carolina called where they call them Gullah and Geechee. They had different names of it, but you can see a lot more of these African and even some Islamic practices that stay. Even though they're all Christian now, you can see some of these roots going straight back to Africa as well.
Yeah. No, subhanAllah. I mean, the reason why I asked that question as well is because you do get sometimes people from Africa, Afro-American, who basically blame the Muslims for the transatlantic slave trade as well, but maybe they're not aware that such a big percentage of those people that were taken across were Muslim. So bro, one last thing I want to just get a few of your thoughts on, because there's so much still to discuss, but maybe we have to do another podcast, right? Is in regards to the we've spoken about the transatlantic slave trade and the conditions and stuff like that. But I think it's important because for our listeners not to put everything under this one category of slavery, how we understand it. So, so maybe if you can give some examples of what the conditions were for the slaves that were taken to, the Americas compared to what we would still call slaves, but in North Africa, in the Muslim lands, because there's many examples, isn't there?
Yeah. And I'm going to get to that in a second, Brother Majid, but I want to go back to your first point about you have a lot of people of African descent who blame Muslims for such and such and such. Now, for your listeners, I am a descendant of slaves. Okay, both sides of my family came from either Alabama or Mississippi. So both my parents converted to Islam, and so I was born into the faith, alhamdulillah. Now, I can't say that Muslims were completely not involved in the transatlantic slave trade, but for the Arab Muslims are generally free of this accusation. There were very few Arabs involved in the transatlantic slave trade. Now, the trans-Saharan slave trade, yes, you can blame them on, but that's really for the Africans in Africa to worry about. That's their beef. They want to fuss and argue about that, they can go to them. For us on this side of the Atlantic Ocean, we can't really blame the Arabs for us being over here. There were some Muslims involved in it and the slave trade, yes, but there are many more, just by pure numbers. There are many more non-Muslim Africans involved, many more. And Muslims made up a good population of the slaves who were brought over as well. So to blame Muslims for this or Islam is really disingenuous, especially when and I hear these things as well, I know I'm getting off point, but I hear these things as well where when people there's a big reparations movement right now going on in the United States trying to get the United States to pay some sort of financial compensation to the descendants of slaves for all the work to help build this country up. And so the movement like that right now, and many people try to, as you mentioned before, deflect. There's a whole lot of whataboutism. Well, what about this and what about that? And the first whataboutism they go to is, what about the Arabs? What about the Muslims? Again, that has very little to do with me and my ancestors. We have almost nothing to do with that because Muslims had very little to do with the transatlantic slave trade. Arab Muslims involved. There were some African Muslims involved, but they were a small percentage compared to the non-Muslim Africans who were involved in it. And even if so, there would have only been maybe at best, maybe 25% of the slave trade was the responsibility of Muslim Africans, and that's being very, very generous. There's probably even less than that. So as far as once they got on that boat, once they got on the boat, actually, it was pure Europeans at that point in time, up until everything else happened after that. And even in the middle of that. So to say that it was Muslims or Arabs or anything like that for the transatlantic slave trade is very disingenuous, and it exhibits a lack of understanding or a lack of knowledge. And it's not fair at all to blame Muslims for that. That is a big deflection by people who don't want the spotlight shine on them for the evil that their ancestors have done. Now, I talked about that. I forgot what you're going to say. You're talking about the treatment of slaves in two different places, right?
And I'm really happy that you cleared it up in the way you did, because that's really important. And you know, right. You hear that quite a bit. And coming from yourself, explaining it the way you did, subhanallah and jazakallah, that was on point.
Well, yeah, I mean, like I said, the people in Africa, they want to talk about. And it's not just Arabs they got to worry about. They can also talk about the Muslim Africans who are involved. Also, they can argue with them. But us over here in the Americas, the Caribbean, we really can't blame Muslims for this one. This is Muslims don't have really much to do with this. So regarding the treatment of slaves, now generally speaking, slaves have been mistreated all over the world. I mean, that's one of the hallmarks of slavery. Slaves are generally mistreated, unfortunately. And no matter how many rules you have, and in the Americas, they have rules too about how you can treat a slave, and they were generally ignored for the most part. And in Muslim society, we have our rules as well, and about treatment of slaves. And sometimes they were ignored, sometimes they weren't. But generally speaking, definitely the treatment of slaves in Muslim society was 100 times better than in non-Muslim society. For one thing, as I mentioned, most of the slaves were domestic slaves. You can't really, and these are also slaves who were brought over for, lack of a better phrase, for sexual purposes. I mean, you're not going to, brutalize the mother of your children or the potential mother of your children, someone whom you hope to procreate with at some point in time. So I'm not saying abuses didn't occur. Obviously they did, but it was not to the same extent. I'm doing some research right now on a man named Frederick Douglass. He was a former slave who escaped slavery and moved up north and everything, became a big abolitionist right before the Civil War happened. His father was white and his mother was black, a black slave. Now, his description of some of the things he's seen as a slave, he was in Maryland, by the way, and Maryland is one of the northernmost American states. And so slaves in Maryland were treated much better than slaves in the South, even in the deeper South, but it still was a slave state. And the things he saw there were so horrific, and the things that he experienced during his time as a slave. He mentioned how he had a 15-year-old aunt. He was still a little boy. He had a 15-year-old aunt who the master really wanted for himself, basically. But she kept rebuffing him and not accepting his advances. But she had, for lack of a better phrase, a black boyfriend that she really wanted to be with, and he forbade her from going to her boyfriend. When she disobeyed him, as most 15-year-old girls would do, he had her tied to a post, and this is in Frederick Douglass's own word. He wrote his own autobiography, so there's not, you can easily go get it easily and read it. Had her stripped bare and just whipped her on her back to a point where blood was running down all down her back. And this is what he saw, and this is in Maryland. Another case where a man who was the former governor of Maryland, he was a former governor of Maryland, but he was a very rich and powerful man. He had two slaves, two men, an old man and his son, who were responsible for caring for his horses. That's the only job for this. The only job I say was to care for the horses. The way Frederick Douglass described how this man, who was a former governor and senator of Maryland, a politician, the way he would find every reason to beat these slaves. He beat the slaves for not feeding the horses enough. He beat the slaves for overfeeding the horses. And this is an old man who he would force him to put his head between his legs. The white slave owner will force the old slave to kneel down, put his head between his legs, and just whip him over and over about his head. Same thing with his son. This is a common practice where these two couldn't escape slavery. And this was, once again, Maryland. And I cannot stress enough, Maryland compared to the Deep South, the treatment of slaves was much better because slavery was dying out in Maryland. And it was right there by Washington, D.C., and right there by the northern states where slavery was mostly outlawed by then. So there was in the Deep South, places like Georgia, Florida, Alabama, Mississippi, and Louisiana, of all places, it was much, 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 much worse. You will definitely hear about abuses of slaves in the Muslim world. Yeah, I'm just doing some history on the Umayyad dynasty right now. And even when their treatment of, say, Persian slaves, they even freed Persian slaves, there are lots of abuses there, but nothing on this level. I mean, the trauma on this level, the Caribbean, and as bad as North America was, the Caribbean was even worse, because in the United States, they wanted to keep their slaves alive, because the United States eventually outlawed the import of slaves from outside the country, and so they had to keep their slaves alive and have them continue to procreate, because there were no more coming in from Africa after a certain period of time. The Caribbean didn't have those rules, even though the British Empire ended slavery beforehand. They didn't have the same rules. Also, in the Americas, most slave owners lived in the Americas with their slaves, and so there was a certain selfish consideration to maintain their business property. Whereas in the Caribbean, most of the slave owners lived in the UK or in France or in Spain, wherever they came from. And so you usually had overseers controlling the slave plantations in the Caribbean. And just like when you rent a car, you don't always take care of that car because it's not your car. Same thing with these overseers. It wasn't their slaves, it wasn't their property. So the mistreatment in the Caribbean was much worse than the mistreatment in the United States. So as bad as the Americas was, the Caribbean was even worse. And also the Caribbean, they were outnumbered as well. Most of the Caribbean states right now, most of the Caribbean nations right now are predominantly Black, whereas here in the United States, Blacks are still part of their minority populations. So the treatment was there's no way you can compare the treatment between the two. Abuses would happen, but the abuses in the Muslim world, at least theoretically, would not be tolerated by the state government. Now, of course, things would happen where people would get away with it, but technically speaking, legally, Muslims couldn't mistreat their slaves. Now, in the Americas, there's some rules for that, but it happened too often for it to be. Because it was a race-based thing. In the Americas, for instance, it was illegal for even free Black people to testify in court, unless it was against another Black person. They couldn't even testify in court against another white person. Yeah. That would never happen in the Muslim world. In the Muslim world, a Muslim of any background could testify for or against another Muslim, no matter what their background was. Now, that doesn't mean there was any discrimination, but it wasn't the same level. And the outcome of it is still going on right now. I mean, we don't have to go but so far. From slavery, you got the Reconstruction era, and you got what was 100 years of Jim Crow, where there's legalized segregation in the southern United States. In the northern United States, it was cultural segregation. In the southern United States, it was legal segregation. And it was more of a separation. It was more creating a different caste system. It was more of a caste system. I won't say consider a class society. It was more of a caste system that tried its best to prevent the intermingling of Blacks and whites throughout much of the South, and to maintain a superior position of whites over Blacks throughout much of the South through separation, and also through legal coercion and all the other tricks and tools they used. In the North, it was a little bit better, but it was more cultural at that point in time. And these things are still being felt even today. In the Muslim world, I can't say that you won't find any discrimination. Of course you will, but it's not on the same level. No. It would not be the same level as you find it here.
No, exactly, bro. And that's why even sort of in my intro, I linked it, the fact that this topic, certainly in America, it hasn't gone away because Jim Crow, civil rights movement, all these things up until what happened last year, it's all linked. Where even if you think about it, you mentioned
It happened last month, Buffalo.
Buffalo. Yeah, I forgot all about Buffalo.
Yeah, that just happened last month. So.
Happened last month, and it's important because maybe in other areas slavery was to do with the class difference, whilst in America certainly race had a part to play, where those people were kind of subhuman. They weren't seen as on the same level as human beings. But I think another thing that's really important is even those people that were freed. So the people in the like in America, for example, if you watch the movie 12 Years a Slave, you have a freed black man who's then enslaved again. So they always must have been looking over their shoulder, because if they ended up in the wrong place, they would be taken, right? But you look in the Islamic heritage, in the history, we'd have Bilal radiallahu anhu. He was the first muaddin, and he stood on the most holiest place in Islam, the Kaaba, to do the adhan. You had, many examples like Sokulu Mahmud Pasha, who was actually given into slavery from his Serbian family, and he became the Grand Vizier of the Ottoman state. You have examples like Malik Ambar in India, who he was, I think, from Abyssinia, I think he was, and he became like, he became the de facto ruler of the place. So the difference is, and I think that's why it's really important to show this, the fact that you can't say slavery was the same everywhere. Certainly nobody wants to be a slave, but it's strange how in the Muslim lands, you actually saw people were encouraged, or they were put into slavery. And it's here now, it's mind-boggling to think that there were parents who gave their children into slavery. Why? Not because to go on the plantations, but because they would move up in society and eventually could be rulers. This is it's really hard to comprehend this. But this is the reality. One last question, bro, I want to mention to you, because otherwise this is going to be a blockbuster episode where it's going to be too long, right? And I want to get your thoughts on this, because there is the debate of the moral awakening narrative and the economic narrative. And I'm talking about in the West. I'm talking about in abolition, because the point I made before was up until the 1700s, around that time, abolition wasn't really spoke about. It was just, slavery was just part of life. It was just there. And some people, it wasn't seen as like a moral evil, right? But what you see is like what the West try to portray is, through the Enlightenment period, that they had this moral awakening, that they realized that slavery is a moral evil, and hence why we see that the first kind of nations who put forward and abolished was like Great Britain and in the Americas and so on. Now, what my question to you is that, do you think that it's a coincidence? This is just your personal opinion here. Do you think it's a coincidence that this moral awakening occurred at the time, and certainly in those areas where you had the start of and the Industrial Revolution, where beforehand maybe animals and humans were needed to transport stuff and stuff like this, but now you could use fossil fuels and you could use water-powered technology and so on. Do you think it's a coincidence?
Right. Well, every great society, every great nation, or every great society, great society that expanded had to have almost all cases until very recently needed slavery to build itself up. Whether the Romans, Greeks, Arabs, French, Spanish, Russians, Chinese, Indians, no matter which one, they're almost before the advent of technology. If you want to build great monuments, you want to build great cities, you want to have large armies to protect your borders and to expand, slavery was almost always used in order to do that. Once the Europeans had conquered most of the Western Hemisphere, most of North America, the Caribbean, and South America, once it got their societies established, and once they began to move away from the restrictions of their churches and began to think more secularly and began to expand and become more secular and look into science and technology. Eventually, the train, the steam engine, these things began to make slavery obsolete. And so the use of slavery became a redundant thing. And now people could think about, well, maybe this is the wrong thing to do. Maybe we shouldn't use it. Now, I'm not saying that every abolitionist thought, okay, well, we have the steam engine now, let's free all the slaves. I don't think they thought that. But the coincidence, the timing is not a coincidence. That's what I should say. The timing is not a coincidence. Once the societies had been built up, once they got the Industrial Revolution going on and technology appears to show that, we really don't need human labor to do all these things anymore. Once that began to happen, the need for slavery and the brutality and the unsightliness of it all, it began to be something that was more of a burden. And more societies began to, particularly the British were probably the first. I think the last might have been either, as far as the Western Hemisphere is concerned, either the Spanish or the Portuguese. Brazil, I think, didn't free them until like 1880, something like that. Cuba, maybe even later than that. But in any case, yes, with the advent of technology and the Industrial Revolution, steam engine, all these things were coming along, electricity. I mean, we literally had telegraph during the Civil War. People could literally communicate with people within seconds, hundreds of miles away in the Civil War. A few years after the Civil War ended, you had steamships crossing the Atlantic Ocean within a matter of days. The first airplane flew in 1903. And just a few years before that, Cuba finally ended slavery. Just a few years before that. So that's, yes, the advent of technology helped to make it so that slavery was no longer a requirement. But even with all that, the United States still had to kill 750,000 of its own people in order to end slavery, even with the morality of it all, even with the British and the French saying slavery is wrong, we need to end that, even with the Industrial Revolution booming in the northern states, even with all that, the slaveholding states of the South who did not really need slaves anymore, they didn't need anymore, they still found a way to justify and were willing to go to war with their own people in order to keep it, and kill almost 1 million of each other. 750,000 Americans died in the Civil War on both sides, altogether on both sides. It took all of that, nearly destroying this country in order to end slavery. That's what it took. So the moral reckoning of it all, the moral reasoning of it all, I mean, I'm not saying that, I don't believe that every abolitionist would necessarily say that, okay, let's end slavery now. We have a telegraph now. We don't need slaves anymore. I'm not saying everyone like that. Everyone was like that, but definitely it allowed people to sit back and reflect on things and allow governments to see that, okay, well, maybe we can't end this brutal practice that we've had for so long. And even with all that, there are many people fighting to keep it going, and not just a few, many, okay?
Yeah.
Thousands of people fighting to keep it going on, even when it was obviously no longer necessary for the maintenance of their society.
Yeah, no, Jazakallah, bro. And I just want to mention there's a quote that I came across by Aristotle, and who we know died in 322 BC. And he said that there will be slavery until looms spin themselves.
Okay. Exactly.
You know what I mean? But bro, this inshallah ta'ala, it's been a blockbuster episode. We've covered so much, and now I know why. When we originally started speaking about this, you were thinking maybe it's a few episodes because there's so much to discuss, and I'm sure there's so much which we've left out. But bro, any sort of final thoughts from yourself, and also maybe mention any new projects that you're working on, just for our listeners to get ready for some new content.
Yes, right now I'm in between episodes. So in between seasons. I just finished this season. What was it? Just a few months ago, we finished the Bosnian War. I hope to move on to the Mughal Empire in a couple of months, inshallah. I do actually want to cover the brother just mentioned from East Africa who became an emperor or de facto ruler in India, Malik Ambar. I do want to cover him. Yeah, I plan on covering him sometime maybe later this month or early next month. So I'm going to do an episode on him. We are now currently doing a series on Africa in general, on Islam in Africa. We just had Somalia in Islam with a brother from the UK, Muhammad Artan. I just had a conversation with him. It's up available now. He's a Somali, but he lives in the UK right now, and he's really good on Islam in East Africa in general. So I encourage you to listen to that. Also, I have a series going on the Sokoto Caliphate. I've already started it, and more episodes will be coming out soon, inshallah. So I encourage people to listen to that, and we'll touch on slavery in Africa as well in these episodes, and it will come out. I'm not going to really dive deep into it, but it will be mentioned in those episodes. So inshallah, I think it'll be a pretty good thing. But hopefully later this fall, I hope to have the next series on the Mughal Empire up and ready, inshallah.
Yeah, no, that's really good, bro. MashaAllah. I know, I really would encourage everyone to check out the Islamic History Podcast. It's funny because on one website that I went on, it was ranked #1 Islamic History Podcast.
Okay.
So I thought, mashallah, really good, because the work is really good, and the sort of areas you cover, and hence why when we were, when I wanted to discuss this issue to do with slavery, because it was like on forums and on the internet, and people, when they would raise the issue to do with the treatment from the Europeans, you would get voices saying, well, what about the Muslims or about the Arabs? And that's when I reached out. I said, bro, you know what? I want to do something on this topic, right?
Yeah.
And you said, look, it's a big topic. Let's take our time and, let's work on it. And alhamdulillah, I think hopefully we've done some justice to this topic. And anything we missed, people can contact myself, and maybe we can do a follow-up on a particular question or anything like that. But certainly go and check out the Islamic History Podcast. The Bosnia season 7, the Bosnian season, it was amazing, and certainly one certainly for people in Europe, especially around my age, who remember when it happened. If you want a comprehensive viewpoint on what went on, definitely recommend that season. But bro, listen, Jazakallah khair for joining me on this episode, man. It was like I said, I've not done one for about 6 weeks, and we're going to come back with a bang, and no one better than yourself. And really, inshallah ta'ala, really encourage that you continue doing what you're doing, and Allah make you successful, and make you successful in this world and in the akhirah. And for all the listeners, you can access the Islamic Vibes podcast on YouTube, on my Path to Revival website, and also on all popular podcast platforms. And a special shout out to the Islamic History Podcast. Definitely check it out. Even if you don't like history, trust me, listen to a few episodes, you'd become a history lover. And we've actually even done a topic on why Islamic history is important.
Yeah.
So that's something which you need to listen to, because it is important. It's not academic. It's important. Even the things that Brother Muttaqi spoke about today, if you don't know this, you will crumble under the pressure of the accusations. It will automatically, you will not be able to reason. It just won't make sense. But bro, inshallah, on that note, big jazakallah khair to you, and inshallah ta'ala, hopefully see you soon. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuhu.